The first gunshot of the night shattered the silence in the blackjack saloon. But it wasn't the sound of violence, merely Old Man Tucker signaling the start of the auction. Abigail Morgan clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders, her knuckles white with tension as she stood on the makeshift auction block, a wooden platform hastily constructed at the far end of the saloon. The year was 1875, and in Green River, Wyoming territory, a young woman's future could be bartered away like cattle on market day. The smoky interior of the saloon was packed with men ranchers, miners, and drifters alike, all eyeing Abigail with varying degrees of interest. Some gazes held hunger, others calculation, as Tucker, the saloon keeper and self-appointed auctioneer, proclaimed the terms of the sale. "Gentlemen, as you know, Harold Morgan's debts have come due. Since the man ain't got nothing else of value, he's offered his daughter to settle accounts. 22 years old, healthy as a horse, can cook, clean, and sew better than most. Bidding starts at $50. Abigail fought back tears of humiliation as she stared at her father, slumped in a corner chair, reeking of whiskey. Just 3 nights ago, he'd gambled away their small farm. And now, in a desperate attempt to clear his remaining debts, he had offered her as payment. The territorial law wouldn't recognize such a transaction as binding, but in Green River, a man's word and a handshake often carried more weight than any legal document. 55, called a grizzled miner from the back. 60, countered a rancher with yellowed teeth and hands like leather. The bids continued to rise, and with each number called, Abigail felt a piece of her soul crumble away. She had always known her father to be a weak man, but she had never imagined he could sink this low. 100, shouted a voice that silenced the room. Every head turned toward the batwing doors where a tall figure stood, backlit by the evening sun. As he stepped into the saloon, Abigail could make out his features: broad shoulders, a strong jawline partially hidden beneath a short beard, and eyes the color of a summer storm. He wore a dark Stetson pulled low, dusty trail clothes, and twin Colt revolvers holstered at his hips. "Yankton Blake," someone whispered, and the name rippled through the crowd. Tucker cleared his throat. "We have 100 from Mr. Blake. Do I hear 110? 110, called the yellow-toothed rancher, though with noticeably less conviction than before. Yankton Blake stepped further into the room, his spurs making a gentle jingling sound against the wooden floor. 200, he countered, his voice calm and measured. The saloon fell silent. $200 was a small fortune in Green River, enough to buy a decent plot of land or several head of cattle. Tucker's eyes widened. 200 from Mr. Blake. Any other bids? The yellow-toothed rancher shook his head and stepped back. Going once, going twice. Tucker paused, scanning the room for any challengers, but none came. Sold. To Yankton Blake for $200. A mixture of relief and dread washed over Abigail as she watched the tall cowboy approach her father, counting out bills from a leather wallet. Her father snatched the money greedily, not even looking at Abigail as he stuffed the bills into his pocket. Yankton then turned toward Abigail, approaching the auction block with measured steps. Up close, she could see that his eyes weren't just gray, they held flecks of blue, like the sky reflected in still water. He couldn't have been more than 30, his face weathered by sun and wind, but handsome nonetheless. He extended a hand to help her down from the platform, and Abigail hesitated, uncertain of what awaited her. Would he expect her to be his wife, his servant, something worse? "Miss Morgan," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "I know this isn't proper, but I'd like to ask you something before we leave." Abigail braced herself, but what he said next caught her entirely by surprise. "What is your choice in this matter?" Yankton asked, those storm-colored eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I've paid your father's debt, but I won't hold you to anything against your will. You can walk out that door right now, free and clear, or—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Or you can come with me to my ranch where you'll have honest work, your own quarters, and my word that no harm will come to you." Abigail stared at him in disbelief. My choice. The concept seemed foreign after everything that had happened. Yankton nodded. "Every person deserves to choose their own path, Miss Morgan, even when others try to decide for them." Abigail glanced toward her father, who was already deep in a card game, the money she had been sold for quickly changing hands. She had nowhere to go. The farm was gone, and a woman alone had few options in the Wyoming territory. "I'll go with you, Mr. Blake," she said quietly, straightening her shoulders. "And I'm grateful for your kindness." Something flickered in Yankton's eyes, perhaps surprise, perhaps approval. He offered his arm, which she tentatively took. "My wagon's outside. Do you have belongings to collect?" "Just a small trunk at the boarding house," she replied. "Everything else was sold with the farm." As they stepped out into the cool evening air, Abigail felt a strange mixture of fear and hope. She didn't know this man, Yankton Blake, but he had offered her something no one else had a choice. And for now, that was enough. The boarding house was a short walk from the saloon. Mrs. Hawkins, the elderly proprietress, watched with concerned eyes as Abigail gathered her meager possessions: 2 dresses, a hairbrush, a small Bible that had belonged to her mother, and a few personal items she had managed to salvage before her father sold everything else. "Are you sure about this, dear?" Mrs. Hawkins whispered as Yankton waited outside. "Mr. Blake has a reputation as a fair employer, but still, a young woman going off with a man she hardly knows." "I don't have many options, Mrs. Hawkins," Abigail replied, snapping the trunk closed. "And something tells me he's a better bet than staying here with father." Mrs. Hawkins pressed a small package into Abigail's hands. "Some bread and cheese for the journey, and if things don't work out at the Blake Ranch, you come right back here. I'll find a place for you." Abigail embraced the older woman, grateful for her kindness. "Thank you. I'll be fine." Outside, Yankton loaded her trunk into the back of a sturdy wagon. 2 horses stood in harness, strong, well-kept animals that spoke of their owner's care. A 3rd horse, a magnificent black stallion, was tied to the back of the wagon. "That's Tempest," Yankton said, noticing her admiration of the animal. "Best cutting horse in 3 territories." "He's beautiful," Abigail said, approaching cautiously and extending her hand. The horse sniffed her fingers, then nudged her palm gently. "He seems gentle for such a powerful animal." "Strong doesn't mean cruel," Yankton replied, helping her onto the wagon seat. "The best strength comes with kindness." As they pulled away from Green River, Abigail couldn't help looking back at the small town that had been her home for all her 22 years. Her father was still inside the blackjack, probably already losing the money from her sale. She felt a pang of grief, not for leaving him, but for the father he might have been, the man her mother had once loved before whiskey and gambling took him. "How far is your ranch?" she asked, turning forward as the town receded into the distance. "About 3 hours' ride," Yankton replied, handling the reins with practiced ease. "It's called Cottonwood Creek Ranch, sits on the North Fork of the Green River. My father started it when he came west in '48, built it up from nothing. And your family, they're all at the ranch." A shadow passed over his face. "My parents died in a flash flood 5 years ago. My sister married a merchant in Laramie last spring. It's just me now, plus about a dozen hands and Mrs. Hatcher, the housekeeper." "I'm sorry about your parents," Abigail said softly. Yankton nodded, his eyes on the trail ahead. Life out here takes as much as it gives. After a moment, he added, Mrs. Hatcher will be glad to have another woman around. She's been saying the house needs a feminine touch. Abigail's stomach tightened. What exactly will be expected of me, Mr. Blake? You mentioned honest work, but— Call me Yankton, he interrupted, then seemed to collect himself. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. At the ranch, you can help Mrs. Hatcher with the house if you're amenable to that. She's getting on in years and could use the assistance. Beyond that, we can figure things out as we go. The important thing is that you'll be safe, paid fairly for your work, and free to leave whenever you choose. The concept of having choices, of being treated with respect rather than as property, was so foreign to Abigail that she found herself blinking back tears. Her father had never been a cruel man, but years of drinking had made him selfish and neglectful. After her mother died of influenza when Abigail was 16, he had sunk deeper into his vices, leaving Abigail to manage their small farm and household with little help. As the wagon rolled on, the landscape opened up before them, rolling hills dotted with sagebrush. The distant mountains, a jagged silhouette against the darkening sky. The vastness of it made Abigail feel small but somehow freer, as if the open spaces were offering her room to breathe for the first time. Tell me about yourself, Miss Morgan, Yankton said after they had ridden in silence for a while. I know your circumstances, but not much else. Call me Abigail, please, she replied. There's not much to tell. My mother and father moved to Green River when I was a baby. My mother taught me to read and write to keep house. After she passed, I took care of my father and our farm as best I could. I like books when I can get them, and I'm good with a needle. Any family besides your father? Abigail shook her head. My mother had a sister in St. Louis, but we lost touch after Mother died. They fell into conversation more easily than Abigail would have expected, Yankton asking thoughtful questions and listening attentively to her answers. As the sky grew darker, he lit a lantern that hung from the wagon, casting a small circle of golden light around them. We should reach the ranch in about an hour, Yankton said, pointing ahead to where the trail curved around a stand of cottonwoods. Once we pass those trees, we'll be on Blake land. Abigail nodded, suppressing a yawn. The emotional toll of the day was catching up to her, and despite her uncertainty about what lay ahead, she found herself drifting into a light doze. She awoke with a start when the wagon came to a stop. Blinking sleepily, she realized they had arrived at Cottonwood Creek Ranch. In the moonlight, she could make out the silhouette of a large main house and several outbuildings. A lamp glowed in one window, and as they approached, the front door opened, spilling more light into the yard. You're back later than expected, called a woman's voice. Was beginning to worry. Had a situation in town, Yankton replied, jumping down from the wagon and coming around to help Abigail. Mrs. Hatcher, this is Miss Abigail Morgan. She'll be staying with us. Abigail, this is Mrs. Hatcher, the backbone of Cottonwood Creek. Mrs. Hatcher was a stout woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, but her face softened with a smile as she looked at Abigail. Well, land sakes, child, you look half frozen. Come in, come in. I've kept some stew warm and there's fresh bread. The house was larger than Abigail had expected, a sprawling two-story structure built of sturdy logs and river stone. The main room had a high ceiling with exposed beams, a massive stone fireplace, and furnishings that were practical but of good quality. It spoke of prosperity without ostentation. Sit yourself by the fire while I dish up some food, Mrs. Hatcher instructed, bustling toward the kitchen. You must be starving. I'll bring in your trunk, Yankton said, already heading back outside. Left alone momentarily, Abigail took in her surroundings with greater detail. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with more volumes than she had ever seen in a private home. A large desk stood in the corner, papers neatly stacked upon it. The furniture was solid and well made, the floors covered with colorful woven rugs. It was a comfortable home, lived in and cared for Mrs. Hatcher returned with a tray bearing a bowl of beef stew, thick slices of bread slathered with butter, and a mug of hot tea. "Eat up, child. You look like a strong wind might blow you away." The stew was delicious, rich with vegetables and tender meat, and Abigail realized she hadn't eaten since morning. She was halfway through the bowl when Yankton returned, carrying her trunk as if it weighed nothing. "I've put fresh linens on the bed in the east room," Mrs. Hatcher told him. "It has its own stove, so she won't freeze in this October chill." "Thank you," Yankton said, setting the trunk down. "I'll take it up once Miss Morgan has finished eating." Mrs. Hatcher brought food for Yankton as well, and the three of them sat by the fire, the older woman peppering Abigail with questions about her skills and experience running a household. Yankton mostly listened, occasionally adding a comment or explanation about the ranch. "We've got about 5,000 acres, he explained when Mrs. Hatcher mentioned the size of the property. "Run about 800 head of cattle, plus the horses. We're smaller than some operations, but our stock is quality." After the meal, Yankton carried Abigail's trunk upstairs to a pleasant room with a brass bed, a dresser, washstand, and small wood stove. A window overlooked what she would discover in the morning was a kitchen garden, and beyond it, the creek that gave the ranch its name. "I hope you'll be comfortable here," Yankton said, setting down the trunk. "If you need anything, Mrs. Hatcher's room is at the end of the hall and I'm across the way." "Thank you," Abigail said, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the day. "For everything." Yankton lingered in the doorway, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "Get some rest, Miss Morgan. Tomorrow's soon enough to figure out everything else." After he left, Abigail sat on the edge of the bed, running her hands over the clean quilt. The room was simply furnished, but warm and clean, a far cry from the cramped attic room she'd occupied at Mrs. Hawkins' boarding house after the farm was sold. As she unpacked her few belongings, placing her mother's Bible on the nightstand, Abigail tried to make sense of the dramatic turn her life had taken. That morning, she had been the daughter of a disgraced gambler with few prospects and dwindling hope. Now she was what? Not a wife, not precisely a servant, but something undefined. A woman with choices, Yankton had said. She climbed into bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin, and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of her new surroundings, the crackle of the fire in the small stove, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft whisper of wind in the cottonwoods outside. Despite her uncertainty, exhaustion claimed her quickly, and she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Morning brought clarity with its golden light. Abigail woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, the sounds of activity in the yard below her window. For a moment, she was disoriented, then the events of the previous day came flooding back. She dressed quickly in her better dress, a simple blue calico, and made her way downstairs. The kitchen was a large, warm space dominated by a massive iron cookstove and a long wooden table. Mrs. Hatcher was at the stove, turning bacon in a skillet while Yankton sat at the table, a cup of coffee in front of him as he reviewed what appeared to be ledgers. "Good morning," Abigail said, somewhat hesitantly. Both looked up, Yankton immediately rising to his feet. "Miss Morgan, I hope you slept well." "I did, thank you." "Well, don't just stand there, girl," Mrs. Hatcher said, gesturing with her spatula. "Sit down and have some breakfast. Can't start the day on an empty stomach." Breakfast was a hearty affair: eggs, bacon, biscuits with honey, and strong coffee. As they ate, Yankton outlined his expectations, which were remarkably reasonable. Abigail would help Mrs. Hatcher with the house and cooking, particularly when the ranch hands came in for meals. She would receive a proper wage, have Sundays free, and, as he had promised in town, could leave whenever she chose. I should return to Green River at some point to collect the rest of the money owed to my father's creditors, Abigail said. I don't want to leave debts unpaid, even if they're not legally mine. Yankton studied her for a moment. That's honorable of you. We can ride into town next week if you'd like. After breakfast, Mrs. Hatcher gave Abigail a tour of the house, 6 bedrooms upstairs, the main floor with its large living area, dining room, study, and kitchen, and a root cellar below. The older woman was brisk but kind, clearly pleased to have help with the substantial work of maintaining such a large household. The men eat in the bunkhouse most days, Mrs. Hatcher explained, but on Sundays and special occasions they come to the main house. 12 hungry cowboys can eat more than a plague of locusts, I'll tell you that. The morning passed quickly as Abigail helped with laundry and bread making. Around noon, several cowboys came to the house to speak with Yankton about some matter concerning the cattle, and Abigail got her first glimpse of the ranch hands. They were a diverse group, young and old, some weather-beaten and grizzled, others barely more than boys. All treated Yankton with obvious respect, and Mrs. Hatcher with a kind of affectionate deference. One of them, introducing himself as Caleb, the foreman, tipped his hat to Abigail. "Madam, welcome to Cottonwood Creek." Word of her arrival had clearly spread, but no one asked awkward questions about how she had come to be there. Abigail suspected Yankton had already provided some explanation that preserved her dignity. As the days passed, Abigail settled into life at the ranch with surprising ease. The work was hard but satisfying, and both Mrs. Hatcher and Yankton expressed appreciation for her contributions. She discovered that Yankton was not only a successful rancher, but also well-read and thoughtful, often discussing books from his extensive library with her in the evenings. A week after her arrival, true to his word, Yankton took Abigail into Green River to settle her father's remaining debts. The trip was uncomfortable. People stared and whispered as they passed, but Yankton's presence beside her gave her strength. They discovered that Harold Morgan had left town the day after selling his daughter, reportedly heading for Denver with what remained of the money. "Good riddance," muttered the shopkeeper to whom Harold had owed $40 for supplies. "No offense, Miss Morgan, but your father was a blight on this town." "No offense taken, Mr. Reynolds," Abigail replied, counting out the money. "I'm well aware of my father's failings." As they prepared to leave town, Yankton surprised her by stopping at the general store. "Is there anything you need?" he asked. "New fabric for a dress, perhaps? Books?" Abigail hesitated, unaccustomed to having money to spend on herself. "I could use some fabric," she admitted, "and thread." By the time they left the store, Abigail had selected material for 2 new dresses, plus ribbons, buttons, and a small volume of poetry that had caught her eye. Yankton insisted on paying, waving away her protests. "Consider it an advance on your wages," he said. "A woman should have pretty things." On the ride back to the ranch, Abigail found herself studying Yankton's profile as he drove the wagon. In the past week, she had come to respect him deeply for his fairness and integrity. He ran the ranch with a firm but kind hand, treating his men well and dealing honestly with everyone. What she didn't understand was why a man like him, successful, educated, and handsome, had remained unmarried. "May I ask you something personal?" she ventured. Yankton glanced at her, his expression open. "Of course. Why did you really help me that night in the saloon?" "You could have simply reported my father for trying to sell a person. which isn't legal even in Wyoming territory. He was quiet for so long that Abigail thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "My mother was in a similar situation once, before she met my father. Her family lost everything in the panic of '37, and her uncle tried to marry her off to settle a debt. She ran away rather than be traded like property. When I saw you standing there," he shrugged, seeming uncomfortable with the emotion in his voice, "I couldn't walk away." "Thank you for telling me," Abigail said softly, "and thank you again for what you did." As autumn deepened into winter, life at Cottonwood Creek fell into a comfortable rhythm. The first snow came in early November, transforming the landscape into a glistening white expanse. Inside the main house, fires burned cheerfully in the hearths, and the smell of baking filled the kitchen as Abigail and Mrs. Hatcher prepared for the coming Thanksgiving celebration. Abigail had finished her new dresses, one a warm brown wool for every day, the other a deep green for special occasions, and found herself taking extra care with her appearance, especially when Yankton was around. She told herself it was simply pride in looking presentable, but deep down, she knew it was more. Over the weeks, her gratitude toward Yankton had evolved into something deeper, something that made her heart race when he entered a room or smiled at her. She tried to keep these feelings hidden, unsure of how they would be received. Yankton had been nothing but respectful, treating her as a valued member of the household rather than as a woman he had essentially purchased, regardless of his noble intentions. There had been moments, a lingering look, a hand offered to help her down from the wagon, an evening spent discussing a book they both loved when Abigail thought she glimpsed something more in his eyes. But he never overstepped the boundaries of propriety. Thanksgiving Day dawned clear and cold, with sunlight sparkling on the fresh snow. The ranch hands, dressed in their Sunday best, crowded into the main house for the feast, which was laid out on tables extended to accommodate everyone. Turkey, venison, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, multiple pies. The bounty reflected the prosperity of Cottonwood Creek. Before they ate, Yankton stood at the head of the table and raised his glass. "I'd like to propose a toast," he said, his gaze sweeping the table and coming to rest on Abigail. "To friendship, to good fortune, and to new beginnings. May we always recognize our blessings when they come to us, even in unexpected forms." "Hear, hear," echoed around the table, and Abigail felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. After dinner, while Mrs. Hatcher supervised the cleanup, and the ranch hands retired to the bunkhouse with full stomachs, Yankton invited Abigail to join him for a walk. The cold air was bracing after the warmth of the house, but Yankton had thoughtfully brought an extra scarf, which he wrapped around Abigail's neck. They walked toward the creek, their boots crunching in the snow, the last light of day painting the western sky in shades of pink and gold. Yankton seemed unusually quiet, almost nervous, which was so at odds with his typical confidence that Abigail found herself growing anxious as well. "Is everything all right?" she asked finally, when they reached a small wooden bridge that spanned the creek. Yankton stopped, turning to face her. "Abigail," he began, then paused, seeming to search for words. "These past weeks having you here at Cottonwood Creek, it's changed things." Her heart skipped a beat. "Changed things? When I brought you here, I meant what I said about giving you choices, about respecting your freedom." He took a deep breath, a plume of vapor visible in the cold air. "I still mean it. Which is why what I'm about to say comes with no expectations, no obligations." Yankton took her gloved hands in his. "I've grown to care for you deeply, more than I thought possible. You're intelligent, kind, strong, everything I've ever admired in a person. I find myself looking forward to seeing you each morning, to our conversations in the evening. I." He faltered, and Abigail felt tears pricking at her eyes, not from sadness but from a joy so intense it was almost painful. "What I'm trying to say," Yankton continued, "is that I'm falling in love with you, Abigail Morgan, and if you could ever consider me as more than your employer, more than just the man who happened to be in that saloon on the right night, I would be honored." Abigail's breath caught in her throat. For a moment she couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the emotions flooding through her. When she found her voice, it was barely above a whisper. "I've been afraid to admit it, even to myself. After everything that happened, it seemed too soon, too complicated. But I've fallen in love with you too, Yankton." The smile that lit his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and kissed her. His lips were warm despite the cold air, gentle but insistent, and Abigail responded with a fervor that surprised them both. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Yankton rested his forehead against hers. "I don't want to rush you," he said. "We can take this as slowly as you need." Abigail smiled, feeling freer and happier than she could ever remember. "I appreciate that, but I think we both know that what's happening between us isn't sudden at all. It's been growing since that night in Green River." As they walked back to the house, hand in hand, snow began to fall again, fat, lazy flakes that drifted down from the darkening sky. Abigail tilted her face up to feel them land on her cheeks, laughing with a joy she couldn't contain. "What is it?" Yankton asked, smiling at her delight. "Just thinking about choices," she replied, "and how sometimes the best ones come when you least expect them." The weeks that followed were the happiest of Abigail's life. Her relationship with Yankton blossomed under the approving eye of Mrs. Hatcher, who confessed she had been hoping they would come to their senses for weeks. They spent their evenings by the fire, reading aloud to each other, discussing ideas, or simply enjoying each other's company. During the day, Abigail continued to help with the household, but now with the knowledge that she was building a future, not just earning her keep. Christmas approached, bringing with it preparations for another celebration. Yankton and several of the hands rode into the hills to cut a pine tree, which they set up in the main room of the house. Abigail and Mrs. Hatcher decorated it with paper ornaments, strings of cranberries, and small candles in metal holders. On Christmas Eve, after a special dinner and carols sung around the piano, which Abigail had discovered Yankton could play with surprising skill, Yankton asked Abigail to accompany him to the study. "I have something for you," he said, closing the door behind them. "I couldn't wait until morning." From his desk drawer, he withdrew a small box wrapped in silver paper. "Merry Christmas, Abigail." She unwrapped it carefully to find a velvet jewelry box. Inside was a ring, a delicate gold band set with a small but perfect diamond that caught the lamplight and scattered it in tiny rainbows. "It was my mother's," Yankton said, his voice thick with emotion. "My father gave it to her the Christmas after they were married. I'd be honored if you would wear it now, as my fiancé." Tears spilled down Abigail's cheeks as she looked from the ring to Yankton's face. "Are you asking me to marry you?" He knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "I am. Abigail Morgan, will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes. Oh, Yankton, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that left her breathless. When they finally separated, both were laughing and crying at once. "I have something for you too," Abigail said, retrieving a package from behind a stack of books where she had hidden it earlier. "Though it pales in comparison." Yankton unwrapped the gift, a hand-knitted scarf in soft gray wool that matched his eyes. "It's perfect," he said, immediately wrapping it around his neck. And it's from you, which makes it the best gift I could receive." They announced their engagement to the household the next morning, to cheers from the ranch hands and a tearfully happy embrace from Mrs. Hatcher. Caleb, the foreman, organized an impromptu celebration, complete with a fiddle player among the hands who struck up tunes for dancing. As January turned to February, preparations for the wedding began in earnest. Abigail, with Mrs. Hatcher's help, started work on her wedding dress, a creation of ivory satin with lace trim that had been ordered specially from Denver. Yankton rode into Green River to arrange for the minister to come to the ranch for the ceremony, which they had decided would take place in early May, when the wildflowers would be in bloom. One evening in late February, as Abigail sat by the fire working on her dress, Yankton entered the room with a serious expression. "There's something we need to discuss," he said, sitting beside her. Abigail set aside her sewing. "What is it?" "I received word today that your father has returned to Green River. He's apparently been telling people that I coerced you in some way, that you're here against your will." Abigail felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "That's ridiculous. Why would he say such things?" "He's claiming that the sale wasn't legitimate because he was drunk, and that I took advantage of the situation." Yankton ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Abigail had come to recognize as a sign of frustration. "He's demanding money compensation, he calls it, after what he did." Abigail was rarely angry, but fury coursed through her now. "He sold me like livestock, and now he wants compensation. I think he's heard about the ranch, about my situation. He sees an opportunity for more money." Yankton took her hands. "I'm not concerned about his claims, they're baseless, and anyone who knows us can see that. But I am concerned about you. This can't be easy." Abigail squeezed his hands. "I need to confront him, to end this once and for all." Yankton looked troubled. "Are you sure?" "You don't owe him anything, Abigail." "I know. But I owe it to myself. I need to look him in the eye and tell him exactly what I think of what he did, and I need to make it clear that my future is with you by my choice." The next day, they rode into Green River together. Harold Morgan was staying at the cheapest boarding house in town, a run-down establishment at the edge of the settlement. When Abigail and Yankton entered the common room, they found him at a table in the corner, nursing a whiskey despite the early hour. He looked up as they approached, his bloodshot eyes widening. "Abby, is that you, girl?" Abigail stood tall, Yankton a solid presence beside her. "Hello, father." Harold's gaze darted between them, calculating. "I've been worried sick about you." "This man took advantage." "Stop," Abigail interrupted, her voice firm. "We both know that's a lie. You sold me to pay your gambling debts. You didn't even look back as you pocketed the money." Harold had the grace to look ashamed, but only briefly. "Now, Abby, you're twisting things." "I was in a bad spot, but I never intended." "I don't care what you intended," Abigail cut in. "What you did was reprehensible, but as it happens, it led me to the best thing that's ever happened to me." She held up her left hand, the engagement ring glinting on her finger. "Yankton and I are getting married in May. I'm here now because I want you to know that, and to understand that you have no claim on me or on him." Harold's expression darkened. "So that's how it is. You're too good for your own father now that you've caught yourself a rich rancher." "No," Abigail said, keeping her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I'm simply making it clear that my life is my own. I've paid your debts in Green River, all of them. Whatever obligation I might have felt toward you is fulfilled." "You ungrateful, that's enough," Yankton interrupted, his tone dangerously quiet. "You've said your piece, Abigail has said hers. Now I suggest you leave Green River and don't return. If I hear that you're spreading more lies about me or about your daughter, we'll have a different kind of conversation." Harold looked like he might argue, but something in Yankton's expression made him think better of it. He slumped in his chair, suddenly looking older and smaller. "Fine, I'll go. But remember, Abby, blood is blood. Someday you might need your old father." "Goodbye, father," Abigail said, turning away. As she and Yankton walked out into the clear winter sunshine, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders, not happiness, exactly, but resolution. A chapter closed. Yankton helped her into the wagon, his touch gentle. "Are you all right?" Abigail looked back at the boarding house, then at the man beside her, the man who had given her choices when everyone else had taken them away. "I am," she said, surprised to find it was true. "I'm more than all right." As they drove away from Green River, Abigail didn't look back again. Her future lay ahead, at Cottonwood Creek with Yankton. Spring came to Wyoming with a rush of green and gold, as if the land were eager to shake off winter's grip. On the ranch, calving season brought long days and nights of watchful care, with Yankton often returning to the house exhausted but satisfied with the growing herd. Abigail threw herself into wedding preparations, determined that their day would be perfect. May 5, 1876, dawned clear and bright, the air sweet with the scent of wildflowers. In her room, Abigail stood before the mirror as Mrs. Hatcher helped her into her wedding dress, the ivory satin gleaming in the morning light, the lace veil softening the edges of her reflection. "You look like an angel," Mrs. Hatcher said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. Yankton won't know what hit him. There was a knock at the door, and Caleb's voice called, "Miss Morgan, the minister's arrived and everything's ready whenever you are." "Thank you, Caleb," Abigail replied. "I'll be down shortly." Mrs. Hatcher squeezed her hand. "I'll go make sure those cowboys are behaving themselves. Take your time, dear." Alone, Abigail took a deep breath, touching the ring on her finger, soon to be joined by a wedding band. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, to this moment, and felt a profound gratitude wash over her. What had begun as the worst day of her life had led to this, to love, to family, to a future brighter than she had ever dared to imagine. A second knock at the door startled her from her reflections. "Abigail," it was Yankton's voice. "May I speak with you? You're not supposed to see the bride before the wedding," she called back, smiling. "It's bad luck." "I'll keep my eyes closed," he promised. "Please, just for a moment." Abigail opened the door to find Yankton standing there, his eyes indeed tightly shut. He was handsome in a new black suit, his hair neatly combed, a small wildflower boutonniere in his lapel. "What is it?" she asked. He reached out, finding her hand unerringly. "I just wanted to tell you something before we go downstairs. Something important. I'm listening." Yankton's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "The night I found you in that saloon, I thought I was doing a good deed, helping someone in trouble. I had no idea I was actually saving myself." Abigail felt tears threatening to spill. "Yankton, let me finish," he said gently. "Before you, Abigail, I was just existing, running the ranch, doing what was expected but not really living. You brought light back into my life. You made Cottonwood Creek a home again. Whatever happens from this day forward, I want you to know that you have given me far more than I could ever give you." A tear slipped down Abigail's cheek. "May I kiss you now, even though it's bad luck?" Yankton's eyes remained closed, but a smile spread across his face. "I think we've had enough bad luck for a lifetime. From now on, we make our own luck together." Abigail stood on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his, a kiss of promise and hope. When they separated, Yankton finally opened his eyes, his breath catching at the sight of her. "You are the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," he whispered. "I'll meet you downstairs," Abigail said, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "I'll be the one in white." Yankton laughed, the sound of pure joy. And I'll be the one waiting for you at the end of the aisle, thanking God for second chances and auction blocks and all the twisting paths that led us to each other. The ceremony took place in the meadow behind the house, where wildflowers created a natural carpet of blue, yellow, and white. The ranch hands had constructed an arch of twisted branches and spring blossoms, under which the minister waited. Yankton stood beside him, his face breaking into a radiant smile as Abigail appeared at the end of the makeshift aisle, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers. With no father to give her away, Abigail had asked Caleb to escort her, which the gruff foreman did with unexpected grace, his weathered face solemn with the honor. As they reached Yankton, Caleb placed Abigail's hand in his employer's with a nod of approval. The minister's words were traditional but heartfelt, speaking of love's endurance through trials and tribulations. When it came time for the vows, Abigail and Yankton had chosen to write their own. "Abigail," Yankton began, his voice strong and clear, "I promise to honor your choices, to respect your strength, to cherish your kindness. I promise to be your partner in all things, to stand beside you in joy and in sorrow, to build a life with you that reflects the best of both of us. I promise to love you with every breath, every heartbeat, every day that I am given." Tears shimmered in Abigail's eyes as she responded, "Yankton, I promise to walk beside you, not behind you or before you, as your equal in your love. I promise to share your burdens and your joys, to respect the man you are and the man you strive to be. I promise to build our home not just of wood and stone, but of love and laughter, of trust and truth. I promise to love you completely and without reservation, today and all the days to come." The exchange of rings Yankton's, a simple gold band that matched Abigail's engagement ring, sealed their vows. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Yankton drew Abigail into his arms for a kiss that brought cheers and whoops from the assembled guests. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with tables set up under the cottonwoods, lanterns hanging from the branches, and enough food and drink to satisfy even the hungriest ranch hand. There was music and dancing, laughter and tears, toasts and tales. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Yankton led Abigail away from the festivities, toward a small rise that overlooked the property. "I want to show you something," he said, pointing toward the western boundary of the ranch where the land rose toward the distant mountains. "Do you see that clearing near the stand of pines?" Abigail squinted, following his gesture. "Yes, I think so. I've been working on something there for the past month, a surprise." Yankton turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I know you love the main house and we're welcome to stay there as long as you wish, but I thought you might like a place that's truly ours. Not built by my father, not filled with old memories, but something new, something we create together." Abigail's eyes widened. "You're building us a house," Yankton nodded, suddenly looking almost shy. "The foundation is laid and the frame is up. I wanted to show you before we continue, so you can make changes if you wish. It's to be your home, after all." "Our home," Abigail corrected, her heart swelling with love for this man who continued to surprise her with his thoughtfulness. They stood together on the rise, watching as the last light of their wedding day painted the land in soft hues. Behind them, the sounds of celebration continued, but in this moment, they existed in a world of their own, a world of promise and possibility. "I love you, Mrs. Blake," Yankton said softly. Abigail smiled at the new name, at the weight and wonder of it. "And I love you, Mr. Blake. Today, tomorrow, always." The years that followed were not without challenges. The harsh Wyoming winters, fluctuating cattle prices, and the normal trials of marriage tested them. But Abigail and Yankton faced each obstacle together, their bond growing stronger with each passing season. Their new home, completed by the fall after their wedding, became the heart of Cottonwood Creek Ranch. Built of sturdy logs and river stone, with large windows to catch the light and views of the mountains, it was everything Abigail had dreamed of, spacious enough for comfort, but intimate enough to feel like a true home. In the spring of 1877, Abigail discovered she was expecting their first child. Yankton's joy was boundless. He spent weeks building a cradle from cottonwood, carving intricate designs of leaves and stars into the headboard. When their son, William Harold Blake, was born on a snowy December night, Yankton wept as he held him for the first time. "He has your eyes," Abigail said, exhausted but radiant. "And your determination," Yankton replied, watching in wonder as the tiny fingers curled around his thumb. "He's perfect." William, soon nicknamed Will, was joined by a sister, Margaret Rose, in 1879, and another son, Joseph Thomas, in 1882. Their children grew strong and healthy in the clean Wyoming air, learning to ride almost as soon as they could walk, helping with ranch chores as they grew older, and filling the house with laughter and occasional chaos. Through it all, Abigail and Yankton remained devoted to each other, their love deepening with shared experiences, the beauty of watching their children grow, the satisfaction of seeing the ranch prosper, the comfort of facing life's hardships together. Cottonwood Creek Ranch expanded over the years, with additional land purchases, improved breeding stock, and modernizations that kept pace with the changing times. Yankton's reputation for fair dealing and quality cattle spread, bringing prosperity that allowed them to give their children advantages neither of them had known in their own youth: education, travel, opportunities to pursue their dreams. In 1889, as Wyoming moved toward statehood, Abigail became involved in the women's suffrage movement. Wyoming Territory had been the first to grant women the right to vote in 1869, and Abigail worked to ensure this right would be preserved when Wyoming became a state. Yankton supported her efforts wholeheartedly, proud of her passion for justice. "You've come a long way from that auction block in Green River," he teased one evening as she prepared for a meeting in Cheyenne. Abigail smiled, pinning her hat in place. "Thanks to a certain cowboy who asked me what I wanted instead of telling me." On their 20th wedding anniversary, Yankton surprised Abigail with a trip to San Francisco, a city neither had ever visited. They spent 2 weeks exploring the bustling metropolis, marveling at the cable cars, the grand hotels, the ships in the harbor bound for exotic destinations. "You ever regret it?" Abigail asked one evening as they strolled along the waterfront, watching the sunset paint the bay in shades of fire. "Staying in Wyoming. We could have had a different life in a place like this." Yankton looked at her, his storm-gray eyes as intense as they had been that first night in the blackjack saloon. "Not for a single moment," he said. "Cottonwood Creek is where we belong. It's where we built our life, raised our children. It's home." Abigail squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses earned through years of hard work. "Yes," she agreed, "it is." They never heard from Harold Morgan again after that confrontation in Green River. Years later, they received word that he had died in Denver, penniless and alone. Abigail mourned not the man he had been at the end, but the father she had known in childhood, before whiskey and gambling had corrupted him. She named their middle child Joseph Harold, honoring the good in her father while acknowledging the past. As the new century dawned, bringing with it automobiles, telephones, and other marvels, Cottonwood Creek Ranch adapted and thrived. Will, now in his 20s, took on more responsibility, showing his father's head for business and his mother's compassion. Margaret, a spirited young woman of 18, announced her intention to attend college, the first in the family to do so. Joseph, the youngest at 15, was already showing talent as a horseman, winning competitions throughout the territory. On a warm evening in May 1901, as they celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary surrounded by family and friends, Yankton led Abigail away from the gathering to the same rise where he had shown her the site of their future home so many years before. The cottonwood trees along the creek had grown taller, the ranch buildings more numerous, but the essential character of the land remained unchanged: wild, beautiful, enduring. 25 years, Yankton marveled, his arm around Abigail's waist. His hair was silvered at the temples now, lines of experience etched around his eyes, but he was still handsome, still the man who had captured her heart. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I saw you standing in that saloon, looking so brave despite everything. Abigail leaned into him, content in the solid warmth of his presence. At 48, she had her own silver threads among the brown laugh lines that spoke of a life well lived. And sometimes it feels like I've known you forever, like there was never a time when we weren't together. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the land in gold. Below them, their children and grandchildren, Will's twins, just learning to walk, continued the celebration, their voices carrying on the evening breeze. "You remember what I asked you that night?" Yankton said finally. "After the auction, you asked me what my choice was," Abigail replied softly. "No one had ever asked me that before." Yankton turned to face her, taking both her hands in his as he had done countless times over the years. "And if I asked you now, looking back on all these years, all the joys and sorrows we've shared, what would your answer be?" Abigail looked up at him, at the face she had woken to for 25 years, the man who had been her partner, her lover, her friend through it all. "My choice would be the same," she said. "It would always be you, Yankton. It would always be us." He kissed her then, a kiss that held all the passion of their youth and all the depth of their shared history. When they parted, both were smiling, their eyes bright with unshed tears. "Come on," Abigail said, tugging him gently back toward the gathering. "Our family is waiting, and we have many more years ahead to make more memories together." Hand in hand, they walked back down the hill, toward the lights and laughter, toward the future they continued to build, choice by choice, day by day together. In the years that followed, Cottonwood Creek Ranch continued to prosper under the guidance of Yankton and Abigail, and increasingly, their children. Will married the daughter of a neighboring rancher, combining their lands and expanding the Blake holdings significantly. Margaret returned from college with a teaching degree and founded a school on the ranch that served not only the Blake children, but those of the ranch hands and nearby homesteaders as well. Joseph, after a brief stint racing horses professionally, came home to focus on breeding and training the finest cutting horses in Wyoming. As they entered their 60s, Yankton and Abigail gradually handed more responsibility to the younger generation, though neither could imagine fully retiring. They traveled more to New York to see Margaret receive a commendation for her educational work, to Europe for a long-delayed grand tour, to the Pacific Northwest to visit distant family. But they always returned to Cottonwood Creek, to the home they had built together, to the life they had chosen. On quiet evenings, they still sat on the porch swing Yankton had made when Will was born, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains, their hands intertwined as naturally as breathing. "You know what today is?" Yankton asked one autumn evening in 1915, as they rocked gently on the swing. Abigail looked at him curiously. "Tuesday," Yankton chuckled. "It is Tuesday, but that's not what I meant. It's been exactly 40 years since that night in the blackjack saloon. 40 years since I saw the bravest woman I'd ever met standing on an auction block. 40 years, Abigail murmured, leaning her head against his shoulder. It hardly seems possible. I was thinking, Yankton continued, his voice thoughtful, about choices, about how one decision can change the course of an entire life. Abigail smiled, knowing where his thoughts were heading. If you're about to ask me if I would make the same choice again, you already know the answer. Humor an old man, Yankton said, his eyes twinkling. You're not old, Abigail protested, though his hair was fully silver now, his face weathered by decades of Wyoming sun and wind. But yes, 1,000 times yes. Every choice that led me to you, to our children, to this life, I would make them all again in a heartbeat. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. From inside the house came the sounds of their family, the laughter of grandchildren, the murmur of adult conversation, the occasional bark of the ranch dogs. A life full and rich, built on that single moment of choice. I have something for you, Yankton said finally, reaching into his pocket. A small token for 40 years. He pressed a small box into her hand. Inside, Abigail found a delicate gold locket. When she opened it, she discovered a tiny photograph on one side, their wedding day, both of them young and radiant with hope, and an inscription on the other. Every choice led to you. Tears filled Abigail's eyes as Yankton fastened the locket around her neck. It's beautiful, she whispered. Not as beautiful as you, he replied, his voice husky with emotion. Not as beautiful as the life you've given me. Inside, someone began playing the piano, Joseph's eldest daughter, who had inherited her grandfather's musical ability. The melody drifted out through the open windows, a waltz they had danced at their wedding so many years before. Yankton stood, offering his hand with a formal bow. Mrs. Blake, may I have this dance? Abigail laughed, taking his hand and rising from the swing. You may indeed, Mr. Blake. As they swayed together on the porch, beneath a sky now thick with stars, Abigail reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from a desperate night in a smoke-filled saloon to this moment of quiet joy. Life had not always been easy, but it had always been rich with love, with purpose, with the sure knowledge that they faced whatever came together. I love you, Yankton whispered against her hair. And I love you, Abigail replied, the words as true now as they had been the first time she spoke them. Today, tomorrow, always. The music continued and they danced under the stars, two people who had chosen each other again and again through 40 years of shared life. And in that choice, repeated daily through word and deed, they had found a love that endured, a love that had transformed not just their own lives but the lives of everyone around them. In Green River, Wyoming, the blackjack saloon was long gone, replaced by a respectable hotel. The auction block where a frightened young woman had once stood was no more than a distant memory. But the choice made that night, a choice born of courage and compassion, lived on in the lives and love of Yankton and Abigail Blake, in their children and grandchildren, in the prosperous ranch that stood as testament to what could grow from the most unlikely beginnings. And so they danced, these two who had defied convention and circumstance to build a life together, their steps slow but sure, their hearts beating in time with the music and with each other. The past was honored but not dwelled upon, the future faced with the same courage and hope that had brought them together on that fateful night in 1875. The choice, made and remade with each passing day, had led them here to love, to family, to a life of shared purpose and abiding joy. And in that choice, they had found their greatest fortune, their truest home,